This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts always be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Now, today may seem a little more like a Bible study than usual, but we're reading from John's Gospel, and how many of you were here last week? At least a couple of you, right? Okay, we're here last week. And you remember we read chapter 20 of John's Gospel. I'm sure you all remember it chapter and verse. We read chapter 20, and at the end of chapter 20, it says, Jesus did many more signs that are not in this book. But these are in this book so that you may believe. I'm kind of simplifying it. You remember that? Now we're reading chapter 21. It sounded to me like chapter 20 was done, that the book was done, because that's the kind of thing that you use when you're closing something out. So here we are next week reading more stories. And sometimes people ask and have been led to say, oh, well, the gospel already ended. That means this was an addition and this really isn't the gospel. I said, no, hold on. What did chapter 20 say? There are many more signs that Jesus did. At the end of chapter 21, they repeat the same thing. There are many more signs that Jesus did. And chapter 21 ends up saying, there are so many that all the books in the world couldn't hold them. But these are here so that you might believe. So here's how I understand this chapter 21. I don't understand it as some totally unrelated thing that was added after the fact by people who didn't know anything about the gospel. I think that the people who surrounded John, the fellow who was part of the leader of the community that wrote that gospel, they were engaged in all sorts of conflict. And do you know who one of the people they were involved in conflict with was? Peter. Peter had his own group of followers. And so over the years, things kind of eased up. So they decided, well, maybe it's time for us to share some of those other stories that were there all the time, but they didn't use them because they weren't part of the purpose. And so I like to call this chapter 21 the rehabilitation of Peter. Now, sometimes I call it the barbecue, but today it's the rehabilitation of Peter. Because do you remember the last time there was a charcoal fire? On Good Friday, or actually Maundy, Thursday, in the night, as Jesus is being taken to be questioned and interrogated, Peter is standing by a charcoal fire, it says, warming himself. And 3 different people ask him, you're one of his disciples, aren't you? And is Orrin here today? Orrin was Peter in the reading on Good Friday. And I gave him a hard time. I said, Orrin, I've already memorized all your lines. Because Peter says, no, I am not. I tell you, I am not. No, I am not. 3 times, Peter denies that he is a disciple of Jesus. In this passage that we're reading today, when Jesus appears at the shore of the Sea of Tiberias, that's the same as the Sea of Galilee, just kind of from a Roman perspective. As Jesus appears, Peter gets rehabilitated. And as they come off the boat, they notice that Jesus has got a charcoal fire on which he's barbecuing some fish. And he invites them to bring their fish, which he continues to barbecue. And it was interesting because April 1st was a week or so ago, and there were 2 things that came out church-related, one of which I bit on April 1st, but there was another one that said that the Episcopal Church had just approved using fish at communion. And it's because of this passage. Because he takes the bread and he gives it, and he did the same with the fish. So the April Fool's story was very well laid out, very churchy and official language and everything else, that now it's approved that you can use fish as well as gluten-free bread in your... So at this rehabilitation of Peter and at this charcoal fire, Peter, who I think has been very uncomfortable all morning, because when they recognized that it was Jesus, Peter jumps into the water, it says, because he was naked. I think he jumped into the water because he was trying to hide, because he knew what he'd done. And I don't know if any of you have ever had a situation where you knew that you really screwed up. Have you? I know I have. Probably nobody else has. And then you run into somebody who was the person that you really messed up with. And I can just immediately feel my throat kind of start getting dry. My breathing starts to get shallow. And I'm wondering, it's my fight or flight thing kicking in, right? So I can imagine Peter going through all that. Oh my gosh, there's Jesus. And he jumps into the water and evidently then swims to shore. And when we run into that person in our lives, I've been at times like that where you run into that person and what they want to do is vent. Often they want to remind me how badly I screwed up. Now, I have to tell you, I'm probably the person who knows how badly I screwed up more than anybody else. But when I run into folks like that, all they want to do is remind me of how badly I screwed up. But that's not how Jesus takes this, is it? Jesus is at the fire, and he's cooking the fish, and he's been serving, and we're done. He says, hey, Peter, Simon Peter, whatever the name's using, Peter, do you love me more than these? And Peter's saying, yeah, Lord, I love you. Because when Peter denied Jesus, when he denied his discipleship, do you think that Peter was saying, I don't love you, Jesus? I think Peter loved Jesus just as much then, but he was scared. He didn't know, he was beginning to see what it might cost him to be a follower of Jesus. And so he denied that. I'm not one of them because I don't want to end up like him. I don't believe that Peter ever stopped loving Jesus. And I can assure you that Jesus never stopped loving and caring for Peter. And so in this questioning, he goes back and forth. He says, again, Peter. And he asks, he does it 3 times. Okay, you know the 3 times. The real key here is that Jesus isn't venting. Jesus isn't nagging. Jesus isn't saying, Peter, you know, you really dumped on me. The only one that stood up for me was my mom and that disciple whom I love, whose name I won't even mention. There's no venting like that at all. He says, then feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. Jesus is focusing Peter and reminding him that their love and relationship was not ended, but it was challenged. And it was challenged because Peter was thinking more about his own safety and his own situation than he was about the mission. Because the mission is all about tending sheep, feeding sheep, caring for one another. You know, here at St. Paul's, we have kind of an unofficial ministry, pew shepherds. Is there anybody here that would identify themselves as a pew shepherd? Well, Ron Shepherd, I see another one here. Pew shepherds are folks who tend the sheep in the pews around them. They get to know people in the neighborhood. They aren't necessarily knowledgeable about people on the opposite side of the church, but they check in. And when there's something wrong and they say, hey, wow, I haven't seen so-and-so, they check on it. They tend the sheep. I would love to see more people here kind of adopt that role. Yeah, I'm a pew shepherd. And so when I pass the peace, I'm not just greeting everybody I already know and who I haven't talked to for 6 weeks, but I'm actually checking with the sheep around my corner of the church so that I know them, so that I can care for them, tend them, so that we can be a more connected community together. So Jesus is caring for Peter. And Jesus is, instead of venting, Jesus is focusing him back on mission. And then he ends the whole saying, the whole conversation with Peter with the most important message of all. And what was that? Follow me. One of the simplest sermons in the world. One I could not begin to match with the best of my sermons. Jesus said, follow me. You can love me all you want. You can be a great fan. You can like God on Facebook out the yin-yang. But if you don't follow, does it really make a difference? Jesus wasn't venting, but was refocusing, was turning Peter back to the mission and reminding Peter that those who love me need to follow me. Because the mission is about bringing the reconciliation, the rehabilitation of relationship that we've just gone through here. It's about bringing it to the rest of your pews. It's about bringing it to our community. It's about bringing it into politics. It's about bringing it out into the whole world. So I would invite all of you to think about how the rehabilitation of Peter might today be the rehabilitation of Andrew or the rehabilitation of any one of you, and pick that place. And hear Jesus reaffirming the mutuality of that love, and then refocusing each one of us on caring for one another and on following Jesus in his mission.